Sarah Martinez had always been underestimated. At 28, she stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, with a youthful face that made people assume she was fresh out of college rather than a seasoned federal agent. Her dark hair was always pulled back in a neat ponytail, and she preferred simple blazers over flashy suits. Nothing about her appearance screamed authority or power, which was exactly why she was so good at her job. On that crisp October morning, Sarah drove her modest sedan through the gates of Fort Braxton, one of the most secure military installations in the country. She had been assigned to investigate reports of corruption within the base's procurement department. Someone had been selling military equipment to unauthorized buyers, and the trail led directly to this heavily guarded fortress. The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete buildings as Sarah parked her car near the main administrative building. She checked her reflection in the rearview mirror, adjusted her badge on her blazer, and took a deep breath. She had been doing this job for 6 years, but walking into a military base always made her nervous. Military personnel had their own way of doing things, and outsiders were rarely welcomed with open arms. As she approached the security checkpoint, Sarah noticed the guards eyeing her with curiosity. She pulled out her credentials and badge, presenting them to the young corporal behind the bulletproof glass. The soldier examined her identification carefully, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Ma'am, what's the purpose of your visit today?" the corporal asked, his tone professional but slightly skeptical. "I'm here to conduct an official investigation," Sarah replied calmly. "I have an appointment with Colonel Williams at 0900 hours. The corporal made a phone call, speaking in hushed tones before hanging up. He handed back her credentials and gestured toward the visitor's badge machine. "You'll need to wear this at all times while on base, ma'am. Building C is straight ahead, 3rd floor." Sarah clipped the visitor's badge to her jacket and walked through the metal detector. The base was bustling with activity. Soldiers in camouflage uniforms moved with purpose between buildings, vehicles rumbled past carrying supplies, and the distant sound of training exercises echoed across the compound. Building C was an imposing structure made of gray concrete and steel. Sarah found the elevator and pressed the button for the 3rd floor. As the doors opened, she was greeted by a long corridor lined with offices. The walls were decorated with military awards, photographs of distinguished officers, and motivational posters about duty and honor. Colonel Williams's office was at the end of the hall. Sarah knocked on the door and heard a gruff voice call out, "Enter." She pushed open the door and stepped inside to find a middle-aged man in dress uniform sitting behind a large wooden desk. His chest was covered with ribbons and medals, and his gray hair was cropped short in military fashion. "Colonel Williams, I'm Agent Sarah Martinez," she said, extending her hand. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." The colonel stood and shook her hand, but Sarah could sense his reluctance. "Agent Martinez, I'll be honest with you. I don't appreciate having federal agents snooping around my base. We run a tight ship here, and I don't believe there's any validity to these corruption allegations." Sarah took a seat across from his desk and opened her briefcase. "I understand your position, Colonel, but I have evidence that suggests otherwise. Over the past 6 months, several pieces of military equipment have been sold to private buyers without proper authorization. The serial numbers trace back to your base." Colonel Williams leaned back in his chair, his expression skeptical. "What kind of evidence are we talking about here? And what exactly gives you the authority to investigate military operations?" Sarah pulled out a folder containing photographs, documents, and financial records. She spread them across the colonel's desk, pointing to specific items as she spoke. "These are photographs of night vision goggles, tactical radios, and body armor being sold at a gun show in Nevada last month. The serial numbers match equipment that was reported as lost during training exercises here at Fort Braxton." The colonel examined the photographs with growing concern. "This doesn't prove that anyone on my base was involved in illegal sales. Equipment gets lost, stolen, or damaged all the time. It's not uncommon for missing gear to end up in the wrong hands. That's true, Sarah agreed. But when we cross-reference the dates of these training accidents with personnel records, we found some interesting patterns. The same quartermaster sergeant was involved in filing reports for all of these missing items. Sergeant Robert Chen has also made several large cash deposits into his personal bank account that don't match his military salary. Colonel Williams's face hardened. Sergeant Chen has been with this unit for 12 years. He's a decorated soldier with an exemplary service record. I find it hard to believe he would be involved in anything illegal. Sarah understood the colonel's loyalty to his men, but she had seen this kind of denial before. Military units often closed ranks when faced with outside scrutiny, even when evidence pointed to wrongdoing within their ranks. I'm not here to destroy anyone's career, Colonel. I'm here to find the truth and prevent further illegal activity. If Sergeant Chen is innocent, my investigation will prove that. The colonel stood up and walked to the window overlooking the base. What do you need from me? I need access to personnel files, equipment inventories, and financial records. I also need to interview several members of your staff, including Sergeant Chen and anyone else who has access to the equipment room. Colonel Williams turned back to face her. I'll provide you with what you need, but I want to be clear about something. This is a military installation, not a civilian workplace. My soldiers follow orders, maintain discipline, and respect the chain of command. I expect you to show the same respect while you're here. Sarah nodded. Of course, Colonel. I have no intention of disrupting your operations. I just need to follow the evidence wherever it leads. The colonel picked up his phone and made several calls, arranging for Sarah to have access to the base records office and scheduling interviews with key personnel. As he spoke, Sarah studied the man's demeanor. He seemed genuinely surprised by the allegations, which suggested he wasn't involved in the corruption. However, his protective attitude toward his subordinates could make the investigation more challenging. After finishing his calls, Colonel Williams escorted Sarah to the records office, where she spent the next several hours reviewing personnel files and equipment logs. The paperwork painted a picture of a well-organized military unit with standard procedures for equipment accountability. However, Sarah's trained eye began to notice subtle discrepancies in the documentation. Several equipment requisition forms had been altered after they were initially filed. Serial numbers had been crossed out and replaced with different ones, and the handwriting on these changes appeared to match samples of Sergeant Chen's writing that Sarah had obtained from his personnel file. Additionally, the dates of equipment losses seemed to coincide with weekends when the base security was at its lightest. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah compiled a growing list of evidence that supported her suspicions. She photographed relevant documents, made detailed notes, and began to piece together a timeline of the illegal activities. The pattern was becoming clearer with each piece of evidence she uncovered. Around 4 o'clock, Sarah decided to take a break from the paperwork and conduct a physical inspection of the equipment storage facility. She asked a young lieutenant to escort her to the building where military gear was stored and distributed. The facility was housed in a large warehouse with rows of metal shelving containing everything from uniforms to weapons accessories. Sergeant Chen was working in the warehouse when they arrived. He was a stocky man in his mid-30s with short black hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He looked up from his clipboard as Sarah and the lieutenant approached, and she could see a flicker of nervousness in his eyes. Sergeant Chen, this is Agent Martinez from the federal government, the lieutenant said. She's conducting an investigation and would like to ask you some questions. Sergeant Chen set down his clipboard and straightened his uniform. Yes, sir. How can I help you? Agent? Sarah studied his body language as she introduced herself and explained the purpose of her visit. Chen's hands were slightly shaky, and he avoided making direct eye contact. These were classic signs of someone who was hiding something, but Sarah knew she needed to be careful not to jump to conclusions. Sergeant, I'm investigating reports of missing equipment from this facility. Can you walk me through your procedures for tracking and accounting for military gear? Chen cleared his throat and began explaining the standard protocols for equipment management. As he spoke, Sarah noticed that his explanation was almost too perfect, as if he had rehearsed it multiple times. He knew exactly which forms to fill out, which supervisors to notify, and which procedures to follow when equipment went missing. "How often does equipment go missing during training exercises?" Sarah asked. "It happens more often than you might think," Chen replied. "Soldiers are focused on their training objectives, and sometimes gear gets left behind in the field or damaged beyond repair. We file reports for everything that doesn't come back, and we follow up with the unit commanders to try to recover what we can." Sarah nodded and made notes in her notebook. "I've reviewed some of the missing equipment reports, and I noticed that several expensive items have gone missing over the past 6 months. Night vision goggles, tactical radios, body armor. These are high-value items that soldiers would be careful not to lose." Chen's nervousness became more apparent as Sarah pressed him for details. He stumbled over his words slightly and began fidgeting with his glasses. "Well, sometimes accidents happen. Equipment can be damaged in combat simulations, or it might be stolen from vehicles during transport. We do our best to keep track of everything, but it's not always possible." "Have you noticed any patterns in the missing equipment? Specific units that lose more gear than others, or particular types of exercises where losses are more common?" Chen shook his head quickly. "No, nothing like that. The losses seem pretty random to me. Different units, different types of training, different locations on the base." Sarah spent another hour questioning Chen and inspecting the warehouse. The more she observed, the more convinced she became that he was involved in the illegal sales. His explanations were too smooth, his knowledge of procedures too perfect, and his nervous behavior too obvious to ignore. As evening approached, Sarah gathered her materials and prepared to leave the base for the day. She had collected enough evidence to justify a more thorough investigation, and she planned to return the next morning with a team of federal agents to conduct searches and make arrests if necessary. Colonel Williams met her at the security checkpoint as she was leaving. "How did your investigation go today, Agent Martinez?" "I found several interesting leads that warrant further investigation," Sarah replied diplomatically. "I'll be returning tomorrow with additional personnel to continue the inquiry." The colonel's expression grew serious. "I hope you understand the gravity of what you're suggesting. If there is corruption within my unit, it would be a betrayal of everything we stand for as soldiers." Sarah appreciated his honesty. "I understand, Colonel. That's why it's important to get to the truth quickly and handle this matter with discretion." As Sarah drove away from Fort Braxton, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. In her rearview mirror, she noticed a dark sedan that seemed to be following her car. She made several turns to test her suspicion, and the sedan stayed behind her each time. Rather than drive directly to her hotel, Sarah decided to take a detour through a busy shopping district. If someone was following her, she wanted to lose them in traffic before revealing her location. She had learned from experience that corruption investigations could be dangerous, especially when they involved people with access to weapons and military training. The sedan continued to follow her through several turns before finally disappearing into traffic. Sarah couldn't be sure if she had been genuinely followed or if her paranoia was getting the better of her, but she decided to take extra precautions for the remainder of her stay in the area. Back at her hotel room, Sarah spread out all the evidence she had collected and began preparing her report for her supervisor. The case was becoming more complex than she had initially anticipated, and she suspected that Sergeant Chen was not working alone. The sophisticated nature of the equipment sales and the careful alteration of military documents suggested a larger conspiracy involving multiple people. As she worked late into the evening, Sarah received a phone call from an unknown number. When she answered, a man's voice spoke in hushed tones. "Agent Martinez, you need to be careful. There are people on that base who don't want you poking around in their business. Some things are better left alone. The line went dead before Sarah could respond. She stared at her phone, wondering who had called and how they had gotten her number. The threatening tone of the message confirmed her suspicions that she was dealing with more than simple equipment theft. Sarah double-checked the locks on her hotel room door and closed the curtains before continuing her work. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and she needed to be prepared for anything. The investigation was just beginning, and she had a feeling that the most difficult part was yet to come. The next morning brought an unexpected twist to Sarah's investigation. She arrived at Fort Braxton early, planning to meet with the team of federal agents who were driving down from Washington to assist with the case. However, when she reached the security checkpoint, the guard informed her that there had been a change in protocol. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to wait here while I contact General Morrison's office," the young soldier said, his tone more formal than it had been the previous day. "General Morrison?" Sarah asked, surprised. "I was working with Colonel Williams yesterday." "Yes, ma'am, but the general has taken over supervision of your investigation. He wants to meet with you personally before you continue your work on the base." Sarah felt a knot forming in her stomach. In her experience, when higher-ranking officials suddenly inserted themselves into investigations, it usually meant that someone was trying to control or limit the scope of the inquiry. She had hoped to conduct a quiet investigation without drawing attention from the top brass, but it seemed that ship had sailed. 20 minutes later, a military vehicle arrived to escort Sarah to General Morrison's headquarters building. The driver, a stern-faced sergeant, said nothing during the short trip across the base. Sarah used the time to review her notes and prepare for what she suspected would be a challenging conversation. General Morrison's office was located on the top floor of the base's most impressive building. The walls were lined with awards, commendations, and photographs showing the general with various political figures and military leaders. Behind his massive oak desk hung portraits of past base commanders, their stern faces seeming to judge everyone who entered the room. General Morrison himself was an imposing figure. He stood nearly 6.5 feet tall, with silver hair, piercing blue eyes, and a chest full of medals that spoke to a distinguished military career spanning 3 decades. When Sarah entered his office, he remained seated, studying a folder that she assumed contained information about her investigation. "Agent Martinez," he said without looking up. "Please have a seat." Sarah sat down in the chair across from his desk and waited for him to acknowledge her presence. The general's dismissive behavior was clearly intended to establish his dominance in the situation, a common tactic she had encountered when dealing with military personnel who resented civilian oversight. After what felt like several minutes, General Morrison closed the folder and looked directly at Sarah. His gaze was intense and slightly hostile, as if he was sizing up an enemy rather than greeting a federal law enforcement officer. "I've reviewed your credentials and the purpose of your visit," he said, his voice deep and authoritative. "I have to say, I'm not impressed with what I see." Sarah kept her expression neutral. "I'm sorry you feel that way, General. Could you be more specific about your concerns?" The general leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk. "My concern, Agent Martinez, is that you're a young woman with limited experience who is making serious accusations against decorated soldiers based on flimsy evidence and circumstantial connections." The condescending tone in his voice was unmistakable, but Sarah had dealt with this kind of attitude before. "General, with respect, my age and gender have no bearing on my ability to conduct a thorough investigation. I have 6 years of experience in federal law enforcement, and I've successfully closed dozens of cases involving fraud and corruption." General Morrison scoffed. 6 years? That's barely enough time to learn the basics of police work, let alone understand the complexities of military operations. You're way out of your league here, young lady. Sarah felt her anger rising, but kept her voice steady. "I understand that military operations can be complex, but theft is theft, regardless of whether it happens in a civilian or military setting. The evidence I've collected clearly shows that equipment has been illegally sold to unauthorized buyers. Evidence? The general said, his voice dripping with skepticism. You mean a few photographs and some paperwork discrepancies? That's not evidence. That's a fishing expedition. Sarah opened her briefcase and pulled out the folder containing her findings. General, I have documented proof that military equipment with serial numbers matching items reported missing from this base has been sold at gun shows across 3 states. I have financial records showing unexplained deposits into bank accounts belonging to base personnel. And I have witness statements from buyers who can identify the sellers. General Morrison barely glanced at the documents before pushing them back across the desk. None of that proves that anyone on this base committed a crime. Military equipment gets stolen all the time. It ends up on the black market through various channels. You can't just assume that because equipment originated from Fort Braxton, someone here is responsible for selling it illegally. Sarah was beginning to understand that General Morrison had no intention of cooperating with her investigation. His dismissive attitude and refusal to examine the evidence suggested that he was either trying to protect someone or was involved in the corruption himself. General, I'm not making assumptions. I'm following a paper trail that leads directly to specific individuals on this base. Sergeant Chen has been filing false reports about missing equipment, and the timing of these reports coincides with sales at gun shows where the equipment later appeared. The general's face reddened slightly. Sergeant Chen is a good soldier who has served his country with honor. I will not allow you to destroy his career based on your wild theories and circumstantial evidence. Sarah realized that the conversation was going nowhere. The general had clearly made up his mind to obstruct her investigation, and no amount of evidence would change his position. She decided to try a different approach. General, I appreciate your loyalty to your soldiers, but if corruption is allowed to continue unchecked, it will eventually damage the reputation of the entire base. Wouldn't it be better to root out any bad actors and clear the names of the innocent personnel? General Morrison stood up abruptly, his imposing figure casting a shadow across the desk. Agent Martinez, I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding here. You seem to think that your little badge gives you the authority to waltz onto a secure military installation and start making accusations against my soldiers. Sarah remained seated, refusing to be intimidated by his physical presence. My badge represents the authority of the United States government, General. Federal crimes have been committed, and I have the legal right to investigate them regardless of where they occur. The general walked around his desk and stood directly in front of Sarah's chair, looking down at her with obvious disdain. Let me see this badge you're so proud of, he said, his voice laced with sarcasm. Sarah unbuttoned her blazer and showed him the badge clipped to the inside pocket. It was a standard federal law enforcement badge with her identification number and agency logo clearly visible. General Morrison looked at the badge and began to laugh. It started as a chuckle but quickly grew into a loud, mocking laugh that echoed through the office. This is what you're using to justify your presence on my base? He said between laughs. This phony badge that looks like it came from a toy store? Sarah felt a surge of anger at the general's insulting behavior. There's nothing phony about my badge or my authority, General. I am a federal agent conducting an official investigation. The general's laughter became even louder. Young lady, I've been in the military for 30 years. I've worked with real federal agents, FBI personnel, and Pentagon investigators. Their badges look nothing like this cheap piece of tin you're waving around. Sarah stood up, no longer willing to tolerate the general's disrespectful treatment. General Morrison, I don't appreciate your tone or your accusations. My credentials have been verified by your base security, and I have every legal right to be here. Legal right? The general said, still chuckling. Based on what authority? This fake badge that any kid could buy online? He reached out and tapped the badge with his finger dismissively. I think it's time for you to pack up your little investigation and head back to whatever mall security job you really work. Sarah's patience finally reached its breaking point. The general's behavior was not only unprofessional, but also potentially criminal if he was deliberately obstructing a federal investigation. She reached into her blazer and pulled out a second badge that she kept in a hidden pocket. "Perhaps you'd like to take a closer look at my credentials," she said, her voice now cold and authoritative. As she held up the second badge, the morning sunlight streaming through the office windows caught the polished surface of the metal. The badge was larger and more ornate than the first one, with detailed engravings and official seals that sparkled in the light. General Morrison's laughter died in his throat as he focused on the badge in Sarah's hand. His eyes widened as he recognized the distinctive eagle design and the presidential seal that adorned the center of the badge. The color drained from his face as he realized what he was looking at. "Is that—" he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Sarah replied calmly. "This is my primary identification. I work for the Presidential Security Division of the Secret Service. The badge you were laughing at is my cover identity for undercover operations." The general's mouth opened and closed several times as he tried to process what he was seeing. The Presidential Security Division was one of the most elite law enforcement units in the country, responsible for investigating threats to national security and protecting the highest levels of government. Sarah continued speaking, her voice now carrying the full weight of her authority. "I wasn't sent here to investigate simple equipment theft, General. I'm here because stolen military equipment has been found in the hands of individuals who pose a potential threat to the President of the United States." General Morrison stumbled backward and collapsed into his chair, his face pale with shock. I had no idea. The briefing materials didn't mention—" "The briefing materials weren't supposed to mention my real identity," Sarah said firmly. "This investigation requires the utmost discretion because we believe the corruption on this base may be connected to a larger conspiracy involving domestic terrorists." The general's hands were visibly shaking as he struggled to comprehend the magnitude of his mistake. He had just spent the past hour insulting and obstructing a federal agent whose authority came directly from the highest levels of government. Sarah sat back down, but now the dynamic in the room had completely shifted. "General, I need you to understand the seriousness of this situation. Military equipment from your base has been traced to individuals who are under surveillance for plotting attacks against government facilities. This isn't just about theft anymore. It's about national security." General Morrison fumbled for his phone with trembling hands. "I need to contact my superiors. The Pentagon. Someone needs to know." "Actually, General, your superiors already know. This investigation was authorized at the highest levels of the Defense Department. The question now is whether you're going to help me complete my mission or whether you're going to continue obstructing it." The general set down his phone and looked at Sarah with a mixture of fear and respect. "Agent Martinez, I sincerely apologize for my behavior. I had no idea about the true nature of your investigation or the level of authority you represent. Please tell me what you need from me." Sarah studied the general's face, looking for any sign that his change in attitude was genuine. She had encountered military officers before who tried to cooperate only after they realized they were in trouble. But General Morrison seemed genuinely shocked by the revelation of her true identity. "First, I need you to place Sergeant Chin under immediate surveillance without alerting him to our suspicions. Second, I need complete access to all base records, including classified files that might show connections between base personnel and outside contacts. Third, I need you to maintain absolute secrecy about my real identity and the true scope of this investigation." General Morrison nodded vigorously. "Of course, absolutely. Whatever you need. I'll have my staff prepare all the files immediately." "There's one more thing," Sarah added. "I need to know if you have any personal knowledge of the corruption I'm investigating. Have you noticed any suspicious behavior among your staff?" Any unexplained wealth or unusual activities? The general thought carefully before responding. I've always prided myself on running a clean operation, but I admit that I may have been too trusting of my subordinates. Looking back, there have been some things that seemed unusual but that I dismissed as minor irregularities. Such as? Sergeant Chen has been volunteering for a lot of weekend duty lately, which seemed odd because he used to complain about working extra hours. And I've noticed that some of the junior officers have been spending money on expensive cars and electronics that seem beyond their means. Sarah made notes as the general spoke. These details supported her theory that the corruption involved multiple people working together to steal and sell military equipment. General, I'm going to need a complete list of all personnel who have access to the equipment storage facility, along with their duty schedules for the past 6 months. I also need financial disclosure forms for anyone who has shown signs of unexplained wealth. I'll have everything prepared within the hour, the general promised. As Sarah prepared to leave the office, General Morrison stood and attempted to shake her hand. Agent Martinez, I want you to know that I deeply regret my earlier behavior. I should have shown more respect for your authority from the beginning. Sarah accepted his handshake, but kept her expression neutral. General, I appreciate your cooperation moving forward. Just remember that the success of this investigation depends on maintaining absolute secrecy about what we've discussed here today. As she walked out of the general's office, Sarah reflected on how quickly the situation had changed. One moment she had been treated like an incompetent amateur, and the next, she was being offered unlimited cooperation. The power of her real badge was undeniable, but she knew that respect based on fear rather than genuine understanding could be fragile. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. General Morrison was true to his word, providing Sarah with access to files, personnel records, and facilities that had been off-limits during her previous visit. The additional information painted a clearer picture of the corruption network operating within the base. By evening, Sarah had identified at least 6 individuals who appeared to be involved in the illegal equipment sales. The conspiracy was more extensive than she had initially suspected, involving personnel from multiple departments working together to steal, document, and sell military equipment to buyers across the country. As she prepared to brief her team of agents who had arrived from Washington, Sarah couldn't help but think about the lesson she had learned that day. Respect and authority couldn't be earned through intimidation or dismissive behavior. Real authority came from competence, dedication, and the backing of legitimate institutions. The investigation was far from over, but Sarah now had the resources and cooperation she needed to bring the criminals to justice. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as she moved from the evidence-gathering phase to the arrest and prosecution phase of the operation. 3 days after her confrontation with General Morrison, Sarah stood in the command center that had been set up in a secure conference room at Fort Braxton. The walls were covered with surveillance photos, financial records, and organizational charts showing the connections between the various conspirators. Her team of 6 federal agents had worked around the clock to build airtight cases against each member of the corruption network. Agent David Chen, no relation to the suspected sergeant, was monitoring radio communications while Agent Lisa Rodriguez coordinated with local law enforcement agencies. The operation they were about to launch would be the largest corruption bust in the base's history, and every detail had to be perfectly executed. Team leaders, report status, Sarah spoke into her headset as she reviewed the final arrest warrants. Team Alpha in position at Sergeant Chen's residence, came the first response. Team Beta standing by at the equipment storage facility. Team Gamma ready at the off-base warehouse location. Sarah looked at her watch. It was exactly 6 in the morning, the optimal time to execute simultaneous raids when suspects would be at home and less likely to flee or destroy evidence. She had learned from experience that timing was crucial in multi-target operations. General Morrison entered the command center, his face grave but determined. Over the past 3 days, his attitude had completely transformed from hostile obstruction to eager cooperation. The revelation of Sarah's true identity and authority had shaken him deeply, but it had also opened his eyes to problems on his base that he had previously ignored. "Agent Martinez, I want you to know that this is the most difficult day of my military career," the general said quietly. "To discover that soldiers under my command have betrayed their oath and endangered national security is something I never thought I would face." Sarah looked up from her preparation materials. "I understand how difficult this must be, General, but remember that the vast majority of your personnel are honest, dedicated soldiers. We're only going after the few who chose to break the law." The general nodded, but Sarah could see the pain in his eyes. Military units were like families, and discovering corruption within the ranks was like learning that a family member had committed a serious crime. "All teams, this is command. Execute Operation Clean House," Sarah announced into her radio. Across the base and throughout the surrounding area, federal agents began moving toward their targets. Sarah monitored the radio traffic as teams reported their progress, her heart rate increasing with each update. "Team Alpha has entered the target residence. Suspect Chen is in custody. Team Beta has secured the storage facility. 2 additional suspects detained. Team Gamma has reached the warehouse. Multiple suspects on site." The warehouse location had been a key discovery in the investigation. Using financial records and surveillance footage, Sarah's team had identified a building located 10 miles from the base, where stolen equipment was temporarily stored before being transported to gun shows and private buyers. The warehouse contained enough military gear to outfit a small army. As the morning progressed, reports continued to flow into the command center. By noon, all primary suspects had been arrested, and agents had seized computers, financial records, and physical evidence that would be crucial for prosecution. The scope of the conspiracy was even larger than Sarah had initially estimated. Sergeant Robert Chen had been the central figure in the operation, but he had not been working alone. The investigation revealed that he had recruited 5 other base personnel, including 2 junior officers, a supply clerk, and 2 security guards. Together, they had stolen more than $2 million worth of military equipment over the course of 18 months. The most disturbing discovery came when agents searched the off-base warehouse. Hidden among the stolen military equipment, they found documents and communications that revealed the ultimate destination of some of the gear. Several buyers were individuals who had been flagged by Homeland Security agencies as potential domestic terrorists. Sarah sat in an interview room across from Sergeant Chen, who had waived his right to an attorney and agreed to cooperate with the investigation. The man who had seemed so nervous during their first encounter now appeared defeated and resigned to his fate. "Sergeant, I need you to understand the seriousness of what you've been involved in," Sarah said, her voice firm but not unkind. "This isn't just about theft or even corruption. Some of the equipment you sold has ended up in the hands of people who want to harm innocent Americans." Chen's head dropped, and he covered his face with his hands. "I never meant for it to go that far. It started small, just selling a few pieces of surplus equipment to make some extra money. My daughter needed surgery, and my insurance didn't cover all the costs." Sarah studied the man across from her. She had heard similar stories before. Good people who made bad decisions when faced with financial pressure, only to find themselves trapped in increasingly serious criminal activity. "Tell me how it escalated," she said. "Who approached you about expanding the operation?" Chen looked up, his eyes red with exhaustion and stress. "It was Lieutenant Morrison, the general's nephew. He said he knew buyers who would pay premium prices for certain types of equipment: night vision goggles, tactical radios, body armor, the high-end stuff that's hard to get on the civilian market." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Lieutenant Morrison was General Morrison's nephew, which explained why the general had been so defensive about the investigation. Family loyalty had blinded him to the possibility that someone close to him could be involved in criminal activity. "Did General Morrison know about his nephew's involvement?" Sarah asked. Chen shook his head emphatically. "No, absolutely not. The lieutenant was very careful to keep the general out of it. He said his uncle would never approve and that we had to make sure he never found out." This revelation complicated the situation significantly. General Morrison's obstruction of the investigation now took on a different meaning. He hadn't been protecting criminals. He had been protecting his family without knowing that his nephew was one of the criminals. Sarah continued the interview for another 2 hours, gathering details about the operation and identifying additional co-conspirators who hadn't yet been arrested. By the end of the session, she had enough information to dismantle the entire network and prevent similar schemes from developing in the future. Later that afternoon, Sarah found General Morrison in his office, staring out the window at the base where he had served for the past 5 years. The events of the day had aged him considerably, and she could see the weight of responsibility and guilt on his shoulders. "General, we need to talk about your nephew," Sarah said gently. The general's shoulders sagged. "I suspected as much when I saw his name on the arrest list. David has always been ambitious, but I never thought he would betray his oath like this." Sarah sat down across from the general's desk. According to Sergeant Chen, Lieutenant Morrison was the one who organized the network and connected the thieves with buyers. He used his position and family connections to avoid scrutiny, while his accomplices took most of the risks. General Morrison turned away from the window, his face etched with pain. "I've been thinking about this all day. Looking back, there were signs that something was wrong. David was living beyond his means, taking expensive vacations, buying luxury items. I attributed it to good financial planning or help from his parents, but I should have asked more questions." "General, you can't blame yourself for not suspecting a family member of criminal activity. Lieutenant Morrison deliberately exploited your trust and his position to carry out these crimes." The general sat down heavily in his chair. "The worst part is that I almost derailed your investigation because of my loyalty to him. If I had cooperated from the beginning instead of being defensive, we might have caught them sooner and prevented more equipment from reaching dangerous people." Sarah understood the general's guilt, but she also recognized that his initial reaction was very human. Military culture emphasized loyalty and unit cohesion, which made it difficult for commanders to accept that their soldiers might be criminals. "General, the important thing is that we were able to stop the operation and arrest everyone involved. The equipment that was stolen will be recovered, and the buyers who pose security threats are being investigated by other agencies." Over the following weeks, Sarah worked with prosecutors to build strong cases against all the conspirators. The evidence was overwhelming, and most of the suspects agreed to plea deals rather than face trial. Sergeant Chen received a sentence of 5 years in prison, while Lieutenant Morrison was sentenced to 8 years due to his leadership role in the conspiracy. The case also led to significant changes in base security procedures and equipment accountability systems. General Morrison worked closely with Pentagon officials to implement new safeguards that would make it much more difficult for future theft operations to succeed. 3 months after the arrests, Sarah returned to Fort Braxton to conduct a follow-up inspection and ensure that the new security measures were working effectively. General Morrison met her at the gate personally, a gesture that showed how much their relationship had changed since their first encounter. "Agent Martinez? It's good to see you again," the general said, extending his hand with genuine warmth. "I want to show you the improvements we've made to our equipment security systems." As they toured the base, Sarah was impressed by the comprehensive changes that had been implemented. New tracking systems, improved surveillance cameras, and stricter access controls made it nearly impossible for equipment to disappear without immediate detection. "These improvements are excellent, General," Sarah said as they concluded the tour. "But remember that the most important safeguard is maintaining a culture where soldiers feel comfortable reporting suspicious activity without fear of retaliation." General Morrison nodded. "That's something I've learned from this experience. Leadership isn't just about commanding respect. It's about creating an environment where people can do the right thing even when it's difficult." As Sarah prepared to leave the base for what would likely be the last time, she reflected on the lessons learned during the investigation. The case had started with simple equipment theft, but had evolved into a complex conspiracy that threatened national security. The most important lesson, however, was about the danger of assumptions and prejudices. General Morrison had initially dismissed her because of her age and appearance, nearly derailing a critical investigation. His nephew had exploited family loyalty and trust to carry out criminal activities, and Sarah herself had learned not to underestimate the complexity of human motivations and relationships. The presidential emblem on her badge had ultimately commanded the respect and cooperation she needed to complete her mission. But the real authority had come from her competence, dedication, and commitment to justice. In the end, those qualities mattered more than any symbol of office. As she drove away from Fort Braxton, Sarah received a call from her supervisor in Washington. "Outstanding work on the base corruption case," he said. "We have another assignment for you. Reports of fraud at a Navy shipyard in Norfolk. Are you ready for your next undercover operation?" Sarah smiled as she merged onto the highway. "Absolutely. Send me the briefing materials." The fight against corruption and threats to national security never ended. But Sarah had learned that with persistence, skill, and the right credentials, even the most challenging cases could be solved. Her badge might be small and unassuming, but the authority it represented was backed by the full power of the United States government, and sometimes that was exactly what it took to ensure that justice prevailed over arrogance, corruption, and betrayal. The general had learned not to judge an agent by her appearance, and Sarah had proven once again that real authority came not from intimidation, but from competence and dedication to the law. The case was closed, but the lessons learned would influence both of their careers for years to come. In a world where threats to national security could come from anywhere, including from within the military itself, vigilant investigators like Sarah Martinez stood as guardians against those who would betray their oaths and endanger innocent lives. The presidential emblem on her badge had spoken louder than any words ever could, but it was her actions and dedication that had truly made the difference in protecting the country she had sworn to serve.